I am Dr. Donald Wallenfang, secular Discalced Carmelite and professor of theology and philosophy at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. I welcome you with great warmth to this third video presentation on St. John of the Cross and the Dark Night of the Soul. This video presentation will concentrate on what St. John means by the Night of Spirit. In the second video presentation, I made some highlights of what he means by the Dark Night of Sense, which comes first. But then the Dark Night of Spirit is the ultimate in the spiritual life. It is getting very close to union with God and ending up in union with God. So he has a lot to say about this, especially across his works, the Ascent of Mount Carmel and the Dark Night. These two works that go together as a pair to understand the overall concept of the Dark Night of the soul. So the first passage I want to look at from his work called The Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5. St. John writes that, "In this night of spirit, both the sensory and spiritual parts of the soul are despoiled of all these apprehensions and delights, and the soul is made to walk in dark and pure faith, which is the proper and adequate means to divine union. As God says through the book of the prophet Hosea, I will espouse you, that is, unite you, to me through faith." So the night of the Spirit implies the night of sense has already taken place. And we are deprived, despoiled of all apprehensions of sense, but also becoming apprehensions of spiritual good, spiritual delight. In the spiritual life, once we've done away with vices of the flesh, we have to contend with vices of the spirit. Things like spiritual pride, spiritual lust, spiritual gluttony, spiritual anger, spiritual greed, all these kind of things. We get spiritually lazy. All of these things we have to contend with in the dark night of spirit. So it's going to require another kind of deprivation of spiritual goods, what might be called God highs, warm fuzzies, memories of those great retreats and spiritual experiences where I felt so much elation. We have to empty our memory of all of this and be purely empty before God. But the paradox is it is an emptiness that is at once a fullness in the spiritual life. It is fullness in the form of emptiness, emptiness in the form of fullness, or at least a fullness on the way. In the Dark Night, his work called The Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 5, Paragraphs 1 and 2, St. John says this dark night of spirit is an inflow of God into the soul, which purges it of its habitual ignorances and imperfections, natural and spiritual, in which the contemplatives call infused contemplation or mystical theology. This divine wisdom is not only night and darkness for the soul, but also affliction and torment. So this is kind of the difficult part. The dark night, both of sense and spirit, is difficult. It's a great challenge because there's such a high prize to be won. In the end, union with God, we have to go through great peril, adventure, and suffering, affliction and torment to get there. Always sustained by God's grace. But the paradox is that God's grace is sustaining us by depriving us along the way, so that we cling only to Him and nothing else. It moves from an active life of prayer to a passive life of prayer. But you could call it an active passivity in the spiritual life. We've disposed ourselves to let God do all the work now within the soul. In the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 2, Chapter 1, Paragraph 2, St. John says, to enter the night of sense and denude itself of sensible things, the soul needed the longings of sensitive love. But all that is required for complete pacification of the spiritual house is the negation through pure faith of all the spiritual faculties and gratifications and appetites. This achieved, the soul will be joined with the beloved God in a union of simplicity and purity and love and likeness. It's a beautiful way St. John describes this union with God, simple, pure, full of love and a likeness of the divine nature. It's also called deification in the spiritual life, the nature of God pouring itself out within us, and therefore we become more like God as we are united to God. And how is God like as a human being in the human nature? Jesus Christ. And close by, the Blessed Virgin Mary. In Book 2, Chapter 1, Paragraph 3 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, St. John goes on to talk about the obscurity of the spirit, or the night of spirit, is far more intense than the obscurity of the night of sense. Just as darkness indicates thicker obscurity than dark night. So he's making this distinction that the darkness of the night of spirit is more dark than the darkness of the night of sense. What else does he say? For however dark a night may be, some objects are still visible. But in total darkness, nothing at all can be seen. In the night of sense, there is yet some light, because the intellect and reason remain and suffer no blindness. But the spiritual night, which is faith, removes everything, both in the intellect and in the senses. For the less a soul works with its own abilities, the more securely it proceeds, because its progress in faith is greater. What a beautiful paradox of our human nature, that the more we work, we can get a certain way down the path. But once we surrender our whole being to God's operation within us, God's activity within us, as St. Teresa of Jesus calls Jesus in the interior castle of the great surgeon, when we let him operate on us and within us, we go much farther, much faster, in the end down the road. In the Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 5, Paragraph 5, St. John says that the soul, because of its impurity, suffers immensely at the time this divine light truly assails it. Wouldn't we think that's a good thing, that divine light is coming over us and into us? He talks about it as we're being assailed by divine light. Because when this pure light of God strikes in order to expel all impurity, persons feel so unclean and wretched that it seems God is against them and they are against God. Wow. So this we notice in the testimonies of the saints, when they say things like, I felt that God didn't love me. I was living for years and felt that God didn't want me, that God abandoned me. They're going through the dark nights of the soul. It's all part of it. It's we say it might be very strange, but this is again to purify all within us that is not of God, even to purify us of all of our concepts of God that are incorrect, that are inaccurate about the one true living God, creator of the heavens and the earth. So much of our talk about God, our imaginations about God, are off. So we're thinking we're talking about God and we don't like this, and the other thing about God, but we're not even thinking about God clearly. So the dark night purifies us of everything that is not of the one true living God, the most holy Trinity. Further in the Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 6, Paragraph 6, St. John says that God humbles the soul in order to exalt it greatly afterward. That's the point in all this. We're not being assailed by divine light just to feel pain and torment and a great fissure of our being. But instead, we're experiencing all these things to grow in our humility so that God will eventually exalt us with Him. Not exalt us in the ways of the world, which are nothing. They're not real. As one of my mentors, Professor Jean-Luc Marion, said when I asked him about his experience of fame, he said, it's not real. Right to the point. It's true. And so instead, to be exalted with God is to be exalted with divine humility, the heart of a servant leader. In The Dark Night, Book 2, further on in chapter 7, paragraphs 4 and 7, St. John says that if it is to be truly efficacious, effective, have its effect, the purgation from the dark night of sense into the dark night of spirit will last for some years. Again, this is not a matter of weeks or months, years. No matter how intense it may be, the purgation will last for years. We want this though, as human beings. We need this. Either now or later. The Catholic Church has this whole doctrine on purgatory, and either we deal with all these inordinate and disordered appetites and affections now, or we'll deal with them later and have all of this temporary punishment due to sin remitted through this process of purgation, purification. Although there are intervals in which, through God's dispensation, this dark contemplation ceases to assail the soul in a purgative mode and shines upon it illuminatively and lovingly. So even if this lasts for years, God gives us some relief. And all of a sudden the divine light is experienced not as torment, but as incredibly illuminating and full of love, which is the truth about it. Because we see ourselves deprived of Him and established in our own miseries, we feel that we truly bear within ourselves every reason for being rejected and abhorred by God. So this is the truth. Why do we experience the light of God as torment and sometimes abandonment? It's because there's such darkness in ourselves that we're working to be overcome. Perfect detachment from sin and every temptation and every lust of the flesh and eyes and the pride of life. We're working to overcome all this, so we experience the light as very convicting and even feel ourselves rejected and even someone might say hated by God. For in loving God so intensely that nothing else gives them concern and aware of their own misery, they are unable to believe that God loves them. Wow, that's really a tough thing. But what assures us that we're on the right path, that we're actually in a dark night and not just some neurotic state of affairs, is that we're committed to seeking God. We never give up the fight. And we're all about it every day. We're in Scripture every day. We're drinking of Word and Sacrament every day. We're connected to the vine. When we're connected to the vine and we know we're serious about this, we're not giving up. We're pressing on with determination every day. And we experience these things. We know this is of God. We're not capitulating back to sin. We're not compromising. We're not selling out. We're not being double-minded. We know what's going on with us is a real dark night in these cases. In the dark night of the soul, further on, Book 2, Chapter 8, Paragraph 1, St. John says, "Indeed, the dark night of spirit is not the time to speak with God, but to put one's mouth in the dust, as the prophet Jeremiah says, that perhaps there might come some actual hope. It's a time of great penance." Again, great self-denial, this dark night of the sense and dark night of spirit. The best language to approach God with is humble and contrite silence. We put our face, we put our mouth in the dust. The last passage I want to take from this short video series, a mini course on St. John of the Cross and the Dark Night of the Soul, comes from, again, his work, The Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 21, Paragraph 11. And this sums up what's happening in the dark night of spirit. Talking about the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and love that St. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. These three remain, and the greatest of these is love. These theological virtues, which are infused virtues by God, have to empty us of our higher faculties of the soul. The intellect is emptied by faith. The memory is emptied by hope, and the will is emptied by love. So he writes this in this passage of the Dark Night. Faith darkens and empties the intellect of all its natural understanding, and thereby prepares it for union with the divine wisdom. Hope empties and withdraws the memory from all creature possessions. For as St. Paul says, hope is for that which is not possessed. And then charity, or love, also empties and annihilates the affections and appetites of the will of whatever is not God, and centers them on Him alone. Thus charity prepares the will and unites it with God through love. The will is really the most important thing in all this that needs to be emptied, because the will is where we decide for or against God. So it is by divine love that the will is emptied of its self-will, its self-determination, and determined completely that the will of God be accomplished through it. In the handout and the resource attached to this video presentation, you'll see a whole other section that unpacks each of these steps. The intellect emptied by faith, the memory emptied by hope, the will emptied by love. So I invite you to read more on this. There's so many other good passages, but I condensed this and put all this in this short presentation just at least to introduce you to the general concept of the dark night of the soul of St. John of the Cross. It's best to read his work in full, but it will take some time to get through it all. It's quite lengthy, and you have to have a lot of discipline and determination to read through it all, word for word. But what I've done here is try to give you some of the basic points and at least get you going in a better understanding of what St. John of the Cross means by the dark night of the soul. And I hope you don't feel overwhelmed at all. I hope you don't feel like this is impossible, this is for the spiritual elite or something. No, it's for each one of us by God's grace. By granted, we're all called to different vocations in this life, and so not everyone has hours a day to contemplate like those in certain forms of religious life and dedicated to the contemplative life, like the Discalced Carmelites. But those of us who are lay people, married, have families, have jobs and everything else, we at least can dedicate hopefully upwards of 90 minutes a day, just at least maybe starting with that, or even starting with 60 minutes a day to our spiritual life, to spiritual exercise. And hopefully this mini course is going to empower you even more to do just that. So I'd love to hear any questions you have and feedback in the comment section. And thank you so much for participating in this mini course on St. John of the Cross and the Dark Night of the Soul.